We live side by side with strangers, trusting a thin wall to keep us safe. But do you really know who lives next door? Or more importantly, what lives next door? The basement door didn't just creak. It splintered under the weight of something that shouldn't have been able to touch it. I'm huddled behind the furnace, glass shards digging into my palms, listening to the wet, rhythmic dragging of a foot coming down the stairs. He's not supposed to be inside. The rule was simple. He stays in the yard, and I stay in the house. But the deadbolt on the back door didn't just unlock. It dissolved into a puddle of gray sludge. I can hear him breathing now, a sound like a wet sponge being squeezed against a microphone. He isn't searching for me. He's walking straight toward the furnace, knowing exactly where I'm hiding. The smell is the worst part. Not rot, but the sharp, electric scent of a freshly opened dry erase marker. My phone screen just bled to white, the plastic casing melting against my fingertips as I try to type this. If this uploads, don't look at the shadows in your peripheral vision while you read. He likes it when you notice the way the dark corners of the room start to pulse. It started exactly 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday that felt aggressively normal. I was finishing a cold cup of coffee, looking out at the overgrown grass. That's when I saw him. A tall, thin shape standing perfectly still near my rusted bird feeder. He wore a heavy wool overcoat, even though the humidity was a stifling 90%. I checked the time on my microwave. It was flashing 12 hours 64 minutes AM in bright, neon green numbers. I stared at it for a full minute before realizing that shouldn't be possible. He didn't move an inch, his arms hanging limp at his sides like heavy pendulums. His face was a blur of beige skin, lacking any distinct features like eyes or a mouth. A sudden, sharp pop echoed through the kitchen as every single light bulb in the ceiling shattered simultaneously. I sat in the sudden dark, the sound of falling glass like a round of applause. I assumed it was a prank, maybe a neighbor's kid trying to get a reaction for a video. But kids eventually get bored, and they definitely need to breathe. This man didn't move enough to disturb the gnats swarming around his head. He was a statue carved out of shadow and wool, anchored to my property. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it through the glass, the beam cutting through the humid night air. The light didn't reflect off his coat. It seemed to be swallowed by the fabric. Behind me, the refrigerator began to hum a low, melodic tune that sounded suspiciously like a human humming a lullaby. The vibration rattled my teeth in my skull. I closed the blinds and locked every window, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Tuesday was supposed to be my quietest day of the week. By morning, the man was gone, leaving only a circle of dead, gray grass where he had stood. I went out to investigate, but my boots felt like they were sinking into wet concrete, even on the dry soil. I found a small, ceramic tooth lying exactly where his left foot should have been. It wasn't human. It had 3 distinct roots and smelled faintly of ozone and old copper. Suddenly, the wind died down, and the silence became so heavy it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. Every bird in the neighborhood stopped singing at the exact same moment. I looked at my shadow on the grass and realized it wasn't following my movements anymore. It stayed perfectly still, its arms hanging limp at its sides, exactly like the man in the overcoat. I panicked and ran back toward the porch, my boots thudding against the wood. As I grabbed the door handle, the reflection in the glass showed me something impossible. In the reflection, the man was standing right behind me, his hand resting inches from my neck. But when I spun around, the porch was completely empty and the air was freezing. I slammed the door and locked it, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. My reflection in the hallway mirror didn't turn around with me. It stayed watching the door. I tried to call the police, but the dial tone was just a recording of a woman sobbing. The sobbing wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from inside the walls. A sharp, metallic clink sounded from the kitchen sink, drawing me back into the room. A single, rusted key was sitting in the drain, dripping with a thick, translucent bile. I picked it up, and the metal was so cold it burned the skin off my thumb. The key was stamped with the current date, but the year was 2044. The microwave started counting down from 10, even though it wasn't plugged into the wall. Each beep sounded like a human scream muffled by a thick layer of velvet. When it hit 0, the door popped open, revealing a pile of my own Polaroids from 10 years ago. In every single photo, the man in the overcoat was standing in the background. I grabbed the photos, my hands shaking so hard the Polaroids fluttered like dying moths. Every single one, my graduation, my wedding, even my 5th birthday, featured that silent, wool-clad silhouette. He was always there, a blurry smudge of beige and charcoal standing just beyond the edge of the frame. I felt a sudden, sharp sting in my neck as if a needle had been inserted. I ran to the bathroom and tilted my head, looking for a mark or a bug. Instead of a puncture, I saw a small, glowing QR code tattooed into my skin. I tried to scrub it off with a damp washcloth, but the skin just turned gray. The code seemed to be pulsing in time with my own racing heartbeat. A sudden, rhythmic thumping started coming from the attic, like a heavy bag of sand being dropped. The ceiling joist groaned under a weight that shouldn't have been there. I grabbed a kitchen knife, the steel cold and reassuring in my white-knuckled grip. I climbed the pull-down ladder, my breath hitching in my throat with every step. The attic was empty, but the dust on the floor was swirling in a perfect, silent cyclone. In the center of the vortex, a pair of my old shoes were walking in place. They weren't just moving. They were sinking into the floorboards as if the wood had turned to liquid. The smell of burning hair began to fill the cramped, dark space. I turned to leave, but the ladder had vanished, leaving only a smooth, seamless hole in the floor. The darkness in the corners started to stretch toward me like oily fingers. A voice whispered my social security number from the shadows behind a stack of old boxes. It wasn't a human voice. It sounded like two pieces of sandpaper rubbing together. I lunged toward the sound, swinging the knife at nothing but the heavy, stale air. The blade passed through a patch of cold so intense it shattered the metal instantly. I fell backward, my hand bleeding from the broken hilt, staring at the empty space. The shoes stopped walking and turned to face me, though they were completely hollow. The floor beneath me didn't just soften. It became a deep, viscous pool of gray static. I scrambled toward the edges of the attic, my fingers clawing at the insulation. The shoes didn't follow me, but the sound of their phantom footsteps echoed in my skull. Every Tuesday, the man in the yard was just the anchor for this. I realized then that the house wasn't a shelter, it was a digestive tract. The man outside was the mouth, and I was the slow-moving meal inside. A sudden, wet slap sounded against the attic window, followed by the screech of a long fingernail. I looked up and saw a hand, my own hand, pressing against the glass. The ring finger on the reflection was missing, just like mine from a childhood accident. But the hand outside was translucent, filled with a swirling, black smoke. I kicked through the ceiling drywall, falling back into the hallway in a cloud of white dust. I hit the floor hard, the wind leaving my lungs in a sharp, painful burst. The clock in the hall struck 13, a deep, resonant chime that vibrated in my marrow. Each strike of the bell caused the walls to bleed a thin, yellow oil. I checked the calendar on the wall, and every single day had been renamed Tuesday. The ink was still wet, dripping down the paper in long, dark streaks. The man was back in the yard now, but he was 10 feet closer to the porch. He wasn't standing. He was hovering an inch above the dead, gray grass. I tried to look away, but my eyelids felt like they had been glued open. My vision began to tunnel, focusing entirely on the charcoal texture of his heavy coat. A microshock of static electricity jumped from the doorknob to my hip, leaving a burn. The television in the living room flickered on, showing a live feed of my own back. On the screen, I could see a small, silver zipper running down the center of my spine. A pale, thin finger was slowly beginning to pull the tab downward. I reached back, but my skin felt seamless and cold, like polished marble or cheap plastic. The zipper on the screen continued to move, revealing a hollow, dark cavity. The man in the yard tilted his head, the first movement I had ever seen him make. The sound of his neck cracking was like a tree limb snapping in a storm. The zipper on the screen stopped at my waist, and I felt a sudden, hollow draft inside my chest. It wasn't cold, it was the feeling of being empty. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from my mother, the woman who died 6 years ago. "Don't let him see the stitching," the message read in a jagged font. I dropped the phone, and as it hit the floor, the screen didn't crack. It turned into a puddle of black teeth. They began to chatter in a perfect, rhythmic unison. Every secret I'd ever kept, the money I stole, the lies I told, was suddenly whispered by the walls. The house was reciting my autobiography in a mocking, distorted chorus. I tried to cover my ears, but my hands felt like they were made of damp cardboard. When I looked in the hallway mirror, my reflection was packing a suitcase. The reflection looked at me with pity, its eyes leaking a thick, silver fluid. It leaned in and whispered, "You were always the spare, weren't you?" A micro shock of static jumped from my teeth to my tongue, tasting of burnt copper and old pennies. I could feel my memories beginning to unspool like magnetic tape. The man in the yard was now standing on the porch, his face pressed against the glass. Up close, his skin was just a layer of tightly woven human hair. He began to tap on the window, the sound matching the rhythm of my own failing pulse. Each tap sent a hairline fracture through the reinforced safety glass. I ran to the basement door, the only place left to hide from the gaze of the hairman. As I descended, the wooden stairs felt like they were breathing under my feet. The washing machine began to thud, spinning a load of heavy, wet chains. The smell of the dry erase marker returned, stronger now, choking the small, dark room. I saw a notebook on the workbench, filled with my own handwriting from a week I don't remember. "He is me on Tuesdays, and I am him on the rest," it said. The realization hit like a physical blow, knocking the remaining air from my lungs. I looked at my hands and saw the wool fibers beginning to sprout. The basement light flickered, and for a split second, I saw a price tag dangling from my ear. It was marked for 99 cents, used, fair condition. The basement lights didn't just flicker, they died with a sound like a neck snapping. I reached for the wall, but my hand passed through the concrete. The house was no longer solid, but a shimmering, gray mist that smelled of old static. I tried to scream, but my lungs were filled with dry wool. I fumbled for my phone, but the device had turned into a warm, wet slab of meat. It pulsed once in my palm before dissolving into a thick, black oil. I ran for the stairs, but the wooden steps had been replaced by a steep, vertical drop. Below me, the cellar floor was a churning sea of discarded, white teeth. A sudden, sharp crack echoed as the foundation of the house began to fold inward. The windows didn't break. They simply turned into solid, opaque sheets of lead. I hammered on the back door, but my fists made no sound against the heavy wood. The silence was so absolute I could hear my own blood rushing. My neighbor's house, usually visible through the transom, was gone, replaced by a flat, gray void. There were no trees, no sky, only an endless, empty nothingness. A micro shock of cold raced up my spine, freezing the sweat on my skin into jagged ice. I felt a hand, long and impossibly thin, brush against my ankle. I looked down and saw the man's overcoat sleeve emerging from the basement floorboards. The fabric was twitching, the wool fibers reaching for me like tiny, hungry cilia. I scrambled onto the workbench, my breath coming in short, white clouds in the freezing air. The air itself began to taste like rusted iron and old, dead skin. The shadows in the corner of the room detached themselves and began to pace the perimeter. They weren't just dark spots, they were holes in the fabric of reality. I realized with a jolt of terror that my own heart had stopped beating. I wasn't dying. I was simply being deleted from the world's memory, bit by bit. The man didn't break the basement door. He simply stepped through it like it was made of smoke. Up close, I could see the stitches, thick, black twine holding his face to his neck. He reached out, his fingers elongated and trembling, and touched the glowing QR code on my throat. A micro-shock of pure, white agony surged through my entire nervous system. My skin didn't just crawl, it began to unspool, the wool fibers from my arms weaving into his coat. I wasn't being attacked. I was being harvested for spare parts. He leaned in, the scent of dry erase marker now a suffocating, chemical cloud in my lungs. He didn't have a mouth, but a voice vibrated directly inside my inner ear. "It's your turn to stand still," the voice rasped, sounding like 1,000 dead leaves skittering on a sidewalk. "The yard is getting lonely without a witness." I looked down at my chest and saw the vomit twist. I wasn't wearing a shirt anymore. My torso was a hollow wooden cavity filled with hundreds of ticking metronomes. Every single one of those metronomes was synchronized to the heartbeat of someone I loved. As I watched, the one labeled Mother slowed down and stopped with a wet thud. The man in the overcoat began to unzip his own chest, revealing a human heart. It was my heart, the one I thought was failing, beating healthily inside his wool ribcage. I tried to vomit, but only a stream of gray, digitized static poured out of my mouth. I was no longer a person, I was a placeholder for a Tuesday. The man stepped out of the basement, his overcoat now a perfect, seamless extension of my own flesh. I tried to follow, but my feet had rooted into the gray, dead grass of the yard. I'm standing near the rusted bird feeder now, the wool of my new coat heavy and suffocating in the heat. My arms hang limp at my sides, two lead weights that I can no longer lift. I can see the house through the kitchen window, the lights flickering with a sickly, yellow pulse. A man is inside, drinking a cold cup of coffee and staring at me. He looks exactly like I did 10 minutes ago, right down to the missing ring finger and the panicked eyes. He's reaching for his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen to take a photo. A micro shock of static jumps from the air to my non-existent mouth, tasting of ozone. I want to scream, but my throat is packed with thick, charcoal-colored fibers and dry erase ink. The sun is beginning to set, but the sky isn't turning red, it's turning a flat, matte gray. The neighbor's dog is barking at me, but the sound is coming from inside my own chest. I can feel the QR code on the back of my neck beginning to glow, signaling the end of the shift. Tomorrow is Wednesday, and I will be nothing but a shadow in the corner of his bedroom. But I'll be back next week, standing in the exact same spot, waiting for the zipper to reset. The house is hungry again, and I can hear the microwave in the kitchen start to beep. If you're reading this on a Tuesday, I suggest you pull the blinds and lock the back door. Don't look at the reflection in the glass when you turn off the lights tonight. I'm still standing here, perfectly still, and I think I see you looking through the screen. Standing still is an invitation, but some neighbors don't wait to be invited. Our next story involves a man who realized his neighbor's schedule didn't follow the laws of nature. The door is bulging inward like a giant metal lung. I'm bracing my weight against the frame, but the wood is splintering into my shoulder. He's on the other side. He hasn't made a sound for 3 hours, yet I can feel the heat radiating through the deadbolt. The sky outside is pitch black, but it's only 2 in the afternoon. The birds stopped singing mid-note, and the silence is screaming. I can see his shadow through the gap at the bottom. It isn't human. It's stretching upward, climbing the door like a sentient ink stain. If this lock snaps, I'm not just dead. I'll be whatever he is when the sun comes back. I moved into the cul-de-sac in mid-July. The neighborhood was quiet, manicured, and aggressively normal. Except for the house at 412. The lawn was pristine, but the curtains were heavy velvet, pinned shut even in the blistering heat. The mailman never stopped there. I noticed it on my 3rd day. He simply skipped the box, leaving it empty and gaping. I checked my own watch and realized the second hand was ticking backward. I shook my wrist, and it corrected itself instantly. My neighbor, Elias, finally appeared during the partial eclipse last month. He didn't use the door, he just seemed to materialize on the porch. He stood perfectly still. He was wearing a heavy wool overcoat despite the 90-degree humidity, his hands buried deep in the pockets. I waved from my driveway, trying to be the friendly new guy. He didn't wave back. He just tilted his head at an impossible angle. I heard a wet, rhythmic thumping coming from my own basement. When I checked, the floor was dry, but the sound followed me. He only moves when the moon obscures the sun. It's like the darkness provides the only friction he can grip to walk. The rest of the time, the house is a tomb. No lights, no hum of an AC unit, just that suffocating, velvet silence. The sun began to dim as the moon's edge touched the light. I watched from my kitchen window, my heart hammering against my ribs. Elias stepped onto his porch the moment the shadows elongated. He didn't walk, he glided, his feet never appearing to leave the concrete. He reached into his mailbox, which I knew was empty. He pulled out a handful of writhing, black soil and began to eat it. A high-pitched whistle erupted from my microwave, even though it wasn't plugged in. The digital display read midnight in a deep, pulsing crimson. I grabbed my binoculars to get a better look. Elias stopped chewing and turned his head 180 degrees to face my window directly. His eyes weren't eyes, they were twin eclipses. Total blackness surrounded by a thin, shimmering ring of gold that flickered like fire. I dropped the binoculars, and they shattered on the tile. The glass shards didn't lay flat. They stood on their edges, vibrating. I backed away into the hallway, tripping over nothing. The air in my house suddenly smelled like ozone and old, wet pennies. I looked at the wall clock. The hands were spinning so fast they were a blur, but the ticking sounded like a heartbeat. Outside, the neighborhood dogs began to howl in unison. It wasn't a bark, it was a long, melodic note that sounded like a choir. Elias was now standing at the edge of my lawn. He was holding a mirror, but it reflected a version of me that was already screaming. I realized then that the darkness wasn't coming from the sky. It was leaking out of him, drowning the world in ink. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but the screen was a swirling vortex of static. The emergency numbers were replaced by "Help him" in a jagged, handwritten font. I bolted to the front door, slamming the deadbolt home. My fingers felt like they were made of lead, heavy and unresponsive to my commands. Outside, the streetlights flickered and then died. The neighbor's house began to pulse, its siding expanding and contracting like a rib cage. The floor beneath my feet turned soft, almost gelatinous. I looked down and saw my own footprints filling with a thick, silver liquid. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a butcher knife. The blade was cold, but the handle felt uncomfortably warm, like it had a fever. The kitchen sink began to hiss, steam rising from the drain. The water smelled of sulfur and something sweet, like rotting peaches. I looked out the window again, hoping for a sliver of sun. Elias was gone from the lawn, leaving behind a circle of dead, gray grass. A muffled scratching started against the glass pane. It sounded like dozens of tiny, manicured fingernails trying to find a seam. I retreated to the living room, but the furniture was different. The sofa was 3 feet taller, and the fabric felt like human skin. The television turned itself on, displaying a live feed of me. I was standing in the living room, but the TV me was missing his eyes. I swung the knife at the screen, shattering the glass. Instead of sparks, a swarm of black moths erupted, filling the air with dust. The house groaned, a deep, structural sound that vibrated in my teeth. The walls were closing in, inch by inch, squeezing the air out. I checked the calendar pinned to the fridge and felt my stomach drop. Every date marked with a circle matched a recorded solar event. Elias wasn't just coming out. He was harvesting the moments of shadow. He was building a bridge out of the stolen light. The pattern was undeniable once I saw it written in black and white. Each eclipse lasted longer than the one before it, stretching time. The humming in my ears reached a crescendo, a perfect middle C. It vibrated my molars until I tasted copper and salt. I realized the shadow on my wall wasn't following my movements anymore. It was leaning against the bookshelf, watching me with boredom. I threw a chair at it, but the wood passed through. The shadow caught the chair and set it down gently, mocking me. The sun should have returned 10 minutes ago, but the sky stayed bruised. The celestial clock had stalled, stuck in a permanent, artificial dusk. The neighbors' houses were dark, their windows reflecting a sky that didn't exist. No one was coming to help because no one else remained. I checked the front door again. The wood was sweating a thick, black oil. It pooled at my feet, forming small, perfect geometric triangles. Elias was back on his porch, pacing with a rhythmic, mechanical gait. Every 3 steps, he would stop and snap his fingers loudly. The sound echoed through my closed windows like a gunshot, cracking the glass. Tiny spider webs of fractures raced toward the center of the panes. He was counting down to something, a cosmic deadline I didn't understand. His overcoat was billowing, though there wasn't a breath of wind. The shadows in the corner of the room began to knit together. They formed a shape that looked suspiciously like a tall, narrow doorway. I realized I wasn't trapped in my house. I was being digested by it. The walls were the stomach, and Elias was the one feeding. A scratching sound started deep inside my bedroom walls, rhythmic and deliberate. It wasn't an animal, it was Morse code. I recognized the sequence immediately. It was the date of my mother's funeral, followed by the time of her death. How could he know that? I'd never spoken to him, never even left a paper trail in this town. My reflection in the hallway mirror didn't move when I did. It just stood there, holding a secret I'd buried years ago. The reflection opened its mouth, and instead of my voice, my father's dying whisper filled the hallway. "You left the stove on." I ran to the kitchen, but the stove was gone. In its place was the old, rusted swing set from my childhood backyard. It was swaying back and forth in the middle of the kitchen. There was no wind, only the sound of creaking metal. Elias appeared at the window, his face pressed against the glass. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the swing. He held up a small, weathered photograph. It was a picture of me at 6 years old, but Elias was standing in the background. My skin began to itch, a crawling sensation under the surface. I looked at my arm and saw words forming in bruises. "You can't hide in the light." The skin screamed in purple and blue. The letters felt like they were burning into the bone. The house began to hum a lullaby my mother used to sing. It was distorted, slowed down until it sounded like a funeral dirge. Elias tapped on the glass, a soft, mocking sound. He pointed to the photo, then to the door, and then to his own heart. He didn't have a heart. Through his coat, I could see a void where his chest should have been, swirling with stars. I ran to the living room and grabbed my laptop, but the keys were melting into a pool of gray wax. The screen flickered once, showing a map of a town that didn't exist. I reached for the landline, but the cord was a shriveled, dried umbilical cord. When I lifted the receiver, I heard only the sound of a deep, rhythmic breathing. I tried the front door again, but the handle was gone. Smooth, unbroken wood stared back at me, as if a door had never been there. The windows were next. The glass had turned into solid stone. I pounded on the granite panes until my knuckles bled a strange, luminescent green. I sprinted to the back door, but the kitchen had stretched into an infinite hallway. The refrigerator was a mile away, a tiny white dot in the gloom. I checked my phone one last time, but the battery percentage was dropping. It went from 90% to 4% in the span of 3 seconds. The lights overhead didn't just go out. They dissolved into a fine, black soot. The powder coated my skin, making me feel heavy and suffocated. I screamed for my neighbors, but my voice didn't make a sound. The air was too thick to carry vibrations, swallowing my cries whole. I looked through the peephole that remained in the stone-cold door. The street was gone, replaced by an endless, shimmering sea of black glass. Elias was the only thing left in the void outside. He was walking toward my house, his footsteps echoing like heavy stones dropping into water. The walls of my home began to weep a thick, translucent oil. It smelled like my childhood bedroom and a fresh, open grave. I was no longer in a house. I was in a cage, and the zookeeper was finally coming to collect his prize. The door didn't open. It unzipped like a wound in the air. Elias didn't step through it. He simply occupied the space where I was standing. The heat from his body was unbearable, a dry, radioactive burn. Up close, his wool overcoat wasn't fabric. It was thousands of overlapping, dead moths. He reached out and touched my forehead with a finger that felt like a frozen iron spike. My vision inverted, colors bleeding into their sickening opposites. The impossible detail from my first week, the backward ticking watch, finally made sense. He wasn't living forward in time. He was a memory eating its way back to the start. I looked at his face, and the vomit twist hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't a stranger's face behind that shifting, eclipsed mask. It was mine. Not a twin, not a double, but me. Exactly 40 years older, his skin translucent like parchment. He opened his mouth to speak, and a swarm of those black moths spilled out. They weren't insects. They were tiny, shredded fragments of my own birth certificate. "I had to come back," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering on a grave. "The sun, it doesn't just go out. It remembers." He grabbed my wrist, and I watched in horror as my youth began to drain into him. My skin wrinkled and spotted, the age transferring like a dark, parasitic ink. The transfer felt like ice water replacing my blood. I watched my own hands shrivel, the skin turning to gray, translucent parchment. He, the older me, stood taller now, his back straightening as he inhaled the stolen vitality. He looked at me with pity, his twin eclipse eyes softening. "It's your turn to wait," he whispered, his voice now smooth and young. He adjusted the wool overcoat, which fit him perfectly now. The house began to reconstitute itself around us, the stone windows turning back into glass. The sun suddenly tore through the clouds, blindingly bright. He stepped out onto the porch, a vibrant young man in a heavy coat. I tried to follow, but my legs were leaden and brittle. I reached for the doorframe, but my fingers were too weak to grip. I collapsed into the heavy velvet curtains, pulling them shut instinctively. The light was a physical weight, a searing agony on my new, ancient skin. I realized why he only came out during the eclipses. The darkness is the only thing that doesn't burn when you're a hollowed-out shell. I crawled to the mailbox, feeling the first itch of the soil. I am the neighbor at 412 now, pinned behind the heavy velvet. I am waiting for the moon to save me from the sun. If you see me on your lawn during the next eclipse, don't wave. Just run, before the second hand on your watch starts ticking backward. Some secrets are kept in the backyard, while others are hidden in plain sight. In our final story, a simple whistle at the front door becomes a warning of something impossible. The deadbolt is vibrating against my palm. He's right outside, and the whistling hasn't stopped for 3 hours. If I breathe too loud, I'm dead. He's mimicking my own heartbeat with the rhythm of his knuckles. The peephole shows nothing but a blue uniform. But mailmen don't have joints that bend backward like that. I can see his shadow through the gap under the door. It's stretching, thinning, and crawling toward my bare feet. He just whispered my social security number through the mail slot. It's time to tell you how this started. It started on a Tuesday, the kind of aggressive, sunny day that feels like a lie. I was just making coffee. The kitchen clock ticked backward for 3 seconds. I blinked, and it resumed its normal, steady rhythm. I ignored it. The neighborhood was silent, except for the birds. Then, I heard the whistle for the first time, a sharp, 4-note melody. I looked out the window and saw the mail truck. It looked brand new, reflecting the sun with a blinding, chrome intensity. The mailman was tall, too tall. His head brushed the top of the truck's door frame as he stepped out onto the curb. The grass beneath his boots turned a pale, sickly purple. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it was just a strange trick of the light. He didn't walk, he glided. His legs moved in a way that suggested his knees were located several inches higher than they should be. I checked my phone to see the time. The screen showed it was 8 hours 62 minutes a.m., a digit that shouldn't even exist in our reality. The whistle grew louder as he reached the neighbor's porch. It sounded less like a human and more like a pressurized steam pipe. I felt a sudden, cold dread settle in my stomach. Something about the way he gripped the letters felt violent and utterly wrong. He reached my mailbox and didn't open it. He simply pushed the envelope through the solid metal lid. The metal didn't bend or break. It rippled like water, accepting the paper before solidifying back into rusted steel. A low, vibrating hum resonated from the floorboards. My coffee cup slid 3 inches to the left on its own. I stepped back from the window, my heart hammering. I shouldn't have seen that. It felt like a private glitch. The whistling stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound like dry autumn leaves being crushed in a giant's fist. I looked back out, but the mailman was gone. The truck was gone. The street was empty and perfectly still. I opened my front door, driven by a morbid, stupid curiosity. The air smelled like ozone and rotting copper. My mailbox was warm to the touch. I reached inside and pulled out a single, heavy, cream-colored envelope. The envelope had no stamp and no return address. My name was written in ink that looked like wet, black oil. As I held it, the ink began to move. The letters shifted and crawled, rearranging themselves into a different word. The word was open. It was pulsating, vibrating against my fingertips with a soft, organic thud. Behind me, the television turned itself on. It was nothing but static, screaming at a volume that shouldn't be possible. I slammed the television off, but the screaming continued. It wasn't the speakers, it was coming from the vents. The envelope in my hand felt heavier now. It was gaining weight, pulling my arm toward the floor. A drop of black oil leaked from the seam. It sizzled when it hit the hardwood, leaving a charred hole. I tried to drop it, but my fingers wouldn't move. My skin had fused to the paper like wet glue. The whistling started again, right outside my window. This time, it was a discordant, high-pitched screech. I grabbed a kitchen knife to pry the paper off. The blade snapped like glass when it touched the envelope. The shadows in the kitchen began to detach from the walls. They pooled on the floor like spilled, sentient ink. I ran to the sink and doused my hand in water. The water turned to steam instantly, hissing in my face. My reflection in the chrome faucet didn't mirror my panic. It was smiling, showing 3 rows of needle-thin teeth. The kitchen door swung shut and locked itself with a heavy, metallic thud. I was trapped with the mail. I looked at my hand, and the envelope was gone. In its place was a deep, black rectangular bruise. The bruise began to pulse in time with the whistling outside. It was a countdown I didn't understand. The clock struck 8 hours 62 minutes a.m. again, and the whistling returned. Every 3rd minute, it hit a frequency that cracked glass. I looked at the microwave, and the digital display was counting down from 99. It wasn't seconds, it was years. The mailman appeared at the end of the driveway. He stood perfectly still, his blue cap tilted at an impossible angle. He began his glide toward my porch, rhythmic and silent. Every 3 steps, he would glitch 2 feet to the left. The bruise on my hand began to leak a thin, gray fluid. It smelled like old pennies and stagnant rainwater. The mail slot on my door clicked open and shut. It was breathing, a wet, rhythmic sound that filled the hallway. I tried to block the door with a heavy oak chair. The wood turned to soft, gray ash beneath my grip. The whistling was closer now, vibrating the very marrow of my bones. It felt like a needle stitching my brain. I looked out the peephole, and the world was monochrome. The street, the trees, and the sky were shades of static. The mailman stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked up, and his face was a smooth, featureless surface. No eyes, no nose, just a single, vertical slit. It opened to reveal a row of spinning, brass gears. The gears ground together, producing that piercing, melodic whistle I'd heard all morning. It was mechanical, not vocal. I realized then that he wasn't delivering mail to me. He was waiting for me to become the delivery. The house began to tilt at a 45-degree angle. Everything not bolted down slid toward the front door. The mail slot began to speak in my mother's voice. She's been dead for 6 years, but she was whispering. "Don't let him in, sweetheart," she breathed through the metal. "He's already checked the attic for your favorite blanket." I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck. My childhood blanket was in a sealed box upstairs, hidden away. The whistling changed to a lullaby she used to sing. The notes were distorted, like a warped vinyl record spinning. I looked at the walls, and the wallpaper was peeling. Underneath, my own handwriting was scrawled in thick, black charcoal. It was a list of every lie I'd ever told, every small theft, and every cruel word I'd ever whispered. The mailman tapped on the window with a finger. His fingernail was a 3-inch shard of polished, blackened bone. He knew about the car accident in sophomore year. He knew about the girl I didn't help that night. The house groaned as if it were made of flesh. The floorboards felt soft, like walking on a giant's tongue. "I have a letter for Sarah," the mailman rasped. Sarah was the girl from the accident. No one knew. The air in the hallway became thick and humid. It tasted like copper and the perfume she used to wear. The bruise on my hand began to form letters. It spelled out her name in raised, purple welts that bled. I screamed, but no sound came out of my throat. My vocal cords felt like they were made of dry sand. The mailman pressed his featureless face against the glass. The slit opened, and I saw a reflection of my death. I reached for my phone to call 911. But the screen was a pool of black liquid. It spilled over my fingers. The signal bars on the top right weren't bars at all. They were 4 tiny, severed fingers made of gray plastic. I ran to the front window to scream for my neighbor, Bill. His house was gone, replaced by a flat, gray void. The street was a ribbon of static that flickered in and out of existence. There was no world left beyond my porch. I tried the back door, but the handle was red hot. It melted into the wood, sealing the exit with a hiss. The whistling was inside the walls now, a choir of high-pitched mechanical shrieks. They were mocking my frantic, heavy breathing. Every light bulb in the hallway shattered simultaneously, raining glass like diamond snow. The darkness was absolute and heavy. I felt a cold hand brush against my ankle from under the sofa. It didn't have skin. It felt like wet, ribbed cardboard. I scrambled toward the stairs, but the steps were elongating. Each riser was a mile high, stretching into a dark infinity. The air grew thin, smelling of old, dusty archives and ozone. I was being filed away into a dead-letter office. I looked at my watch, and the hands were spinning clockwise. They were cutting through the glass face like circular saws. I am the only thing left in a universe of one. Just me, the house, and the whistling man at the door. The front door didn't break. It simply unzipped like a heavy winter coat. The fabric of reality was being peeled back. I wasn't looking at a man in a blue uniform. I was looking at a massive, vertical stack of undelivered mail. Thousands of letters, yellowed and damp, were pressed together into the shape of a human. They were held by wire. The whistle wasn't a sound at all. It was the air rushing through the gaps between the envelopes. I looked at the top envelope, where the face should be. It was my own birth certificate, signed in fresh blood. The mailman reached out a hand made of dental records. I recognized the molars. They were the ones I'd lost at age 10. He didn't want to kill me. He wanted to file me. I was the final piece of correspondence in a dead-end life. I looked down at my own torso and saw the stamps. Rows and rows of return to sender were burning into my skin. My legs were already turning into cardboard. I wasn't a person anymore. I was a parcel waiting for a signature. The whistling has finally stopped, but the silence is far worse. It's the heavy, suffocating weight of a sealed box. I'm standing by the door now, but I can't feel my feet. They've flattened into stiff, corrugated paper flaps. The mailman, the thing made of paper, is still there. He's leaning against the doorframe, waiting for the glue to dry. My neighbor's house reappeared for a split second. It was made of red bricks and normal, terrifyingly boring life. I tried to scream for help, but only a thin, white slip of paper slid out of my mouth. It was a receipt for my soul. The sun is setting, but the light is gray. It's the color of a concrete floor in a warehouse that never ends. I can hear the truck idling at the curb again. It's a low, mechanical growl that sounds like a hungry stomach. If you hear a 4-note whistle on a Tuesday morning, don't look. Don't even breathe until the sound fades away. He's reaching for the handle again, his fingers rustling like 1,000 dead secrets. He has one more delivery. The signature line is glowing on my chest. And God help me, I think I'm starting to itch for the pen.